The huge mess in Europe got even messier as popular dissatisfaction boiled over all over the continent, upsetting markets in the process. In addition to sifting through the fallout from the shocking results, we have to ask the question: did the European Central Bank cut rates last week in a last-ditch effort to maintain the status quo? And if so, what does that mean? Central banks aren't central banks. They have very little to do with money. At most, you can say they regulate banks. However, what they really are is a tool to maintain the status quo. That's their only real mandate. They pick whatever economic problem they feel is bothering the most people and communicate a policy they say will fix it. Rate policies are entirely communications. They're all about psychology. They've conditioned people to believe that rising interest rates fix inflation and falling rates are helpful and accommodative to a sagging economy. Politicians facing difficult economic challenges absolutely want to send those messages. And the more they say they want to send the rate cut one, the more you know what's really making the electorate unhappy. The idea that central bankers are independent is farcical. They claim independence solely as a means to shield themselves from accountability. But that's ultimately the real issue at stake. The world, and not just Europe, has performed exceptionally poorly the past few years, and people are downright angry about it. They have every reason to be. The entire situation has been mismanaged from the very start, yet no one will admit it. Everyone in position of authority continues to say everything is just fine, is being expertly handled, yet expertly handled right into a nearly 2-year-long recession in Europe that the ECB still won't acknowledge is happening. The most they'll say is there's stagnation. You can't tell me the pressure isn't getting to the governing council members. So popular anger boiled over this past weekend in Europe's election to the European quasi-parliament because quite naturally it was going to. The situation in Europe is grim, and it doesn't seem to be getting any better. So politicians in Europe want to send messages that they say, well, things are going to get better because we've got rate cuts on our side. So we'll start our examination in what happened first in Germany. According to Bloomberg, this is what they wrote. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz's Social Democrats crashed to their worst ever result in European parliamentary elections Sunday, falling to third place behind the, quote, far-right alternative for Germany. And you can tell, anytime anybody's outside the status quo, they're going to call you far right, even though they never talk about the far left, as we'll see with the UK. The conservative CDU-CSU alliance was on course for a comfortable win with 30%, with the AfD second at 16.2% and the SPD with 14%, according to projections from public broadcaster ARD. The other two parties in Scholz's ruling coalition, the Greens and Free Democrats, far left, also fared badly, getting 12% and 4.9% respectively. But as bad as it was in Germany, the results turned out to be even worse over in France. And France, where the economy is performing almost as badly as it is in Germany. Germany is the worst performing out of pretty much everyone in Europe, but France isn't all that far behind them, sadly enough. According to the AP, President Emmanuel Macron dissolved the lower house of France's parliament in a surprise announcement sending voters back to the polls in the coming weeks to choose lawmakers, after his party was handed a humbling defeat by the, quote, far right in the European elections Sunday. The announcement came after the first projected results from France put the, quote, far right National Rally Party well ahead in the European Union's parliamentary elections, handing a chastening loss to Macron's pro-European, quote, centrists, according to French opinion poll institutes. Now, the European Parliament and these elections aren't necessarily that big of a deal, but what they are is an official exercise to gauge the electorate, to see where people are feeling, what they're doing, how they plan on maybe voting in the national elections, more important national elections later on, or in this case, not that much later on. But essentially, it's a full voting exercise to gauge how voters are feeling about various issues. And in this case, the message and the issues were very clear. Europeans are not happy, and they vented, and then some. Whether that carries over to the national elections remains to be seen, and Macron is gambling that they won't, but that's why the French called the snap elections, just to find out. Essentially, the situation in Europe has become untenable, because of course it has. You can't be stuck in a recession for almost 2 years after a period when prices exploded and impoverished basically the entire continent and not expect a backlash. You can tell everyone that everything is just fine, but reality has a way of intruding. And while in the grand scheme of things, rate cuts like rate hikes don't actually matter, politicians find them useful, as central bankers do, as a means to communicate. I hear your pain and I'm doing something about it. Well, they didn't say so explicitly in Germany or Europe. They did in Italy. The Italian government and various members of it came out and said, we welcome these rate cuts. We want more of them. Italian Deputy Prime Minister Antonio Tajani called on the European Central Bank to follow Thursday's planned reduction in borrowing costs with another rapid move. On X, formerly known as Twitter, he wrote, I hope that the ECB will lower the interest rate tomorrow. This is last week. And I believe that a single cut is not enough. A second one is needed quickly to encourage economic growth. So the Italian government is outright embracing, the politicians in the Italian government are outright embracing rate cuts as a useful message. We hear you about the economy and we want these central bankers to do something about it. And it's not just Europe. In the UK, the Tory party and Prime Minister Rishi Sunak have staked everything on this message that we're here to finish the job on inflation and to deliver lower interest rates. They too have embraced falling interest rate. The UK has found itself in very similar circumstances to either Germany or France. And with recent data, it might actually be moving ahead of France and moving closer to Germany, as we'll see in just a moment. So in his election campaign, the right-wing Tory government under Prime Minister Rishi Sunak have made lower interest rates a full part of their electoral strategy. Just last month, at the end of last month, in an interview with The Times, the Prime Minister was asked if if a vote for the Tories was going to mean a vote for lower interest rates. And he said, quote, of course it is, because we are the party who is committed to bringing down inflation, which is a necessary condition for bringing down interest rates. Politicians are embracing lower interest rates because they understand where the economy is going, especially in Europe, where it's very clear the economy is going, and the UK too, though the UK isn't part of Europe politically speaking. The UK economy is fully integrated in the European economy, and it is performing very poorly. When the CPI report last month came out for the UK, and it showed that consumer prices were increasing at the slowest rate of the cycle so far, again, Prime Minister Sunak said, this morning it was confirmed that inflation is back to normal. This means the pressure on prices will ease, and he throws in there, mortgage rates will come down. They keep signaling they want interest rates to come down, and in various places, central bankers are going to heed that pressure, because politicians are responding to this dissatisfaction among voters, which is moving more and more toward recession rather than strictly consumer prices. Having been impoverished by the supply shock and the effect on consumer prices, now voters are saying, I am worried about jobs and incomes and employment. And in the UK, they got some really bad news just today regarding those very issues. Payrolls in the United Kingdom fell for the second straight month in May, and it was the third time in the last 4 months. And the UK unemployment rate has gone up from 3.8% in December to now 4.4% as of April, which is the latest figures. So consumer prices plagued everyone for the last couple of years, and now it's all about jobs, employment. Not just in the UK or Europe either, as we saw in the US payroll report. Well, not the payroll report, everything but the US payroll report. Politicians want to be able to say they're doing something without admitting why they feel the need to do something. Because Sunak can't stand up there and say, we're in a recession and I'll get you out of it with some rate cuts. All he's trying to say is, I hear that the economy isn't performing as well as maybe people would like. We think everything's fine, but here's some rate cuts just so that you feel better about it and maybe vote for me along the way. Same thing across Europe. Don't believe for a second that the European Central Bank wasn't listening to all of those politicians throughout the European continent, the status quo, the ones who are not far right, according to the mainstream media, and said, we need some help here. Otherwise, Europe is at risk of falling victim to political and popular upheaval, which is exactly what the elections this past weekend indicated. That people have had enough and they're willing to at least send a symbolic vote in that direction. Now, we'll see if they send further votes, if they act on these impulses and go even farther in the upcoming national elections. But either way, the economy is driving people on both sides of the aisle, across all parties. It's not a left-right issue. It's whoever is in office at the current moment has to face the consequences for economic conditions that are well below what they should, for bad mismanagement, for poor performance, for recessions, for jobs, and ultimately impoverishment. In the wake of these, I guess, shocking to some people, election results in Europe, there's been a bit of upheaval in European financial markets. There was a sell-off in especially French stocks. The CAC lost about 1.3% today to close at its lowest closing level since February. A lot of it has to do with there was rumors about Macron resigning. There's uncertainty over the upcoming snap elections. There's a whole host of issues that a lot of uncertainty. In fact, Moody's, the ratings agency, injected even more by making comments about the French government's position and their fiscal position. Moody's said this snap election increases the risks to fiscal consolidation and is, quote, credit negative. Given the polarized political environment in France, the winner of these elections is unlikely to have an absolute majority. There is a high risk of greater political instability in the future, especially as the Assemblée Nationale cannot be dissolved within the first year of its term. Potential political instability is a credit risk given the challenging fiscal picture the next government will inherit. And French bonds sold off sharply, first yesterday in the wake of the election results, and then again today, as more political intrigue infests the marketplace. But essentially, it's upheaval, it's uncertainty, it's the very thing that an institution who has been created to maintain the status quo does not want to see. And it continues to spread from there. We've seen safe haven demand go up sharply in German bonds, which those sold off a little bit despite the fact that Germany was involved in the political intrigue just as France was. Interest rates rose yesterday, but they're back down today. Germany being the safe haven play here. Stock markets across Europe, including Italy, they're reaching multi-month lows, even though stocks in the US continue to soar. Essentially, there is a great deal of uncertainty. There's a great deal of potential risk. And it's not just about fiscal consolidation. Again, this is not partisan politics either. This is about establishment versus popular opinion. And popular opinion realizes the economic circumstances are not good, and they are getting worse. As I said in the video last week discussing the ECB's rate cuts, they violated their own standards. They have been saying for 2 years, we are not going to rest until we see inflation or consumer price growth back at our target. And consumer price growth across the rest of Europe is not back at target, yet the rate cuts anyway. So you have to ask why. Part of it, I do believe, is about these politics. They do want to maintain the status quo, and they are tending to agree with national governments as they're currently constituted that the upheaval in political systems is a threat to that status quo. Therefore, why not violate their standards that they themselves have put in place over the last couple of years to see if it doesn't help sway some opinions heading into this, to head off any further political problems before they spill over into the national elections. Instead, popular opinion sent a very strong message to politicians that anger is getting to the point where it really is boiling over. And there's no, it's understandable why that's the case. You look at the European economy, And yes, it was on a bit of an uptick, but all the data that we continue to get recently, up-to-date data, suggests that it's rolling over again in the same way it did last year. So again, that's another factor that the ECB has greatly considered, given huge weight to. The fact that the nascent recovery, as they called it last year, ended up failing, ended up rolling over and becoming more recession through the end of last year. They don't want the same thing to happen this year, especially since the consequences are now no longer strictly about economics. Now they're becoming political as well. As I mentioned, recent data is not looking good for Europe. You got retail sales just recently. They fell again in the month of April after being up in March. Again, suggesting for at least 1 month rolling over. German industrial production was down for the second straight month in April after rising the first 2 months of the year. And German industrial production has to be the most depressing statistic in the entire developed world. It is a complete, utter disaster. So no wonder why there's popular dissatisfaction in Germany. German factory orders fell for the fourth straight month to start this year. So no increase in factory orders from Germany's beleaguered factory sector. Even some of the PMIs that looked relatively decent in recent months, they've started to go lower, including the one for France. Now, I've mentioned before that the PMIs show a very sharp seasonal pattern. Even though these are seasonally adjusted figures, they're a post-pandemic seasonal pattern. And France is already looking like it's following that seasonal pattern, past the upswing in the start of the year into the spring and then summer heading lower. According to the latest statistics from Hanover Commercial Bank, which is S&P Global, their European partner, services number back below 50 for May, the composite back below 49 for May. So Europe is losing momentum because that upswing was only transitory. And so from the European Central Bank's perspective, why not cut rates in violation of their own inflation promise? Because the risks are all on the other side, including politics. So while Europe's economy appeared to be on an upswing, that upswing appears to be rolling over, but the consequences this year, as I just said, are not likely to remain strictly economics. They're now becoming political too, more and more political, as well as risks to finance and markets and everything else. So from the ECB's perspective, their mandate is the status quo. That's their actual mandate is the status quo. Everything about the situation screams, do something. And I don't mean consumer prices. Do something about the economy. Keep it from rolling over. Even if a rate cut is all psychology, when that's all you have, that's all you can give. So, of course, the ECB violated its pledge to strictly target inflation because this isn't about inflation. It's about impoverishment. And people around the world, not just Europe, are really sick of it. They are migrating by the millions from the global south. There are conflicts between nations that are becoming more frequent and more harsh. And ultimately, internal politics are becoming upended. If your job as a central bank is the status quo, you can't have any of these things. We're seeing more and sharper recession signals develop in the US too, not just the UK or Europe. Talked about one at the video link below. As always, thank you very much for joining me. Huge thank you, Eurodollar University members and subscribers. And until next time, take care.